This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Bloomburrow, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone. Earlier today, the full card gallery for Bloomburrow dropped, and that means it's time for my limited set review for the format. Over the next week or so, I'll be evaluating every single card in the set to get you ready for your pre-release or the release of the set on Magic Arena. We're starting today with the multicolored and colorless cards. Multicolored is always a good place to start because these cards do a good job of introducing us to the set's archetypes and mechanics, and they also tend to be some of the most powerful cards in the set. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play boosters also have special guests, but I'll talk about them in a later video. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal here is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some things. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have actually turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once a set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the multicolored and colorless cards, and we're starting with multicolored. Our first card is Alania Divergent Storm. For 3 generic, a blue and a red, it's a 3/5 legendary otter wizard at rare. Whenever you cast a spell, if it's the first instant spell, the first sorcery spell, or the first otter spell other than Alania you've cast this turn, you may have target opponent draw a card. If you do copy that spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. Giving your opponent a card while you get a full card worth of value by copying your spell is a really good deal, as you end up getting something you don't have to pay for, while they do have to pay for what they're getting. Still, it can certainly backfire, and it isn't like Alania has amazing stats or an ability that isn't finicky. It's probably just a B-. Next up, it's Balin the Haymaker, which for a red, a green, and a white is a 4/3 legendary rabbit warrior at rare. You can tap 2 untapped tokens you control to add 1 mana of any color. You can tap 3 untapped tokens you control to draw a card, and you can tap 4 untapped tokens you control and put 3 +1/+1 counters on Balin and against trample until end of turn. One of the big themes in this set is tokens, and it's nice that Balin doesn't care what kind of tokens they are. In other words, food counts just as well as offspring tokens and random 1/1 rabbits. That said, actually going off with Balin and drawing cards and buffing its stats is going to be far from automatic, and getting the mana ability is more attainable, but still, obviously enough, not automatic. I'm not saying you'll never get Balin going, but I am saying that it's going to be a hard to cast 4/3 and not much else a decent chunk of the time. Overall, I think it's a B-. Next up, it's Burrowguard Mentor, which for a green and a white is a star rabbit soldier at uncommon. It's got trample, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. So this is a signpost uncommon for green-white. Obviously that deck's about going wide. This is a 1/1 on its own and will often be larger, and trample makes it a serious threat. However, I don't love that it needs help to be worthwhile. Like, playing it on turn 2 doesn't seem great because it's so vulnerable. It is going to feel really efficient in a lot of games, though. I just don't think it's the kind of signpost uncommon that really pulls me into a color pair. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Camellia the Seed Miser, which for 1 generic, a green, and a black is a 3/3 squirrel warlock at rare. It's got Menace. Other squirrels you control have Menace. Whenever you sacrifice 1 or more foods, you create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token, and you can pay 2 generic and Forage to put a +1/+1 counter on each other squirrel you control. To Forage, you can exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food. A 3-mana 3/3 Menace is a solid starting point, and sometimes she'll come down and make it so squirrels can attack that couldn't before. Then, throw in the fact that she can generate squirrel tokens and buff squirrels, and you have quite the value engine. The fact you can sacrifice food or exile stuff from your graveyard for Forage means you're likely to be able to make squirrels, especially by the mid to late game, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Cindering Cutthroat, which for 2 generic and a black-red hybrid mana is a 3/2 lizard assassin at common. It enters with a +1/+1 counter on it if an opponent lost life this turn, and you can pay 1 generic and a black-red hybrid mana to give it Menace until end of turn. So the ceiling here is a 3-mana 4/3 that can only gain Menace for a significant mana investment. That's okay, but it wouldn't be better than a C+, and it's probably just a C if that's what it always was. And this will often be a 3/2 with conditional Menace. Now, the black-red theme is both lizards and making your opponent lose life so you get bonuses. So there is some synergy here, but this isn't that impressive of a card overall, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Clement, the Worry Wart, which for one generic, a green and a blue, is a 3/3 legendary frog druid. At rare, it's got vigilance. When it or another creature you control enters, you can return up to one target creature you control with lesser mana value to its owner's hand, and frogs you control have tap, add green or blue, spend this mana only to cast a creature spell. This has solid base stats, and its ability to bounce your other creatures can be nice sometimes, though as usual, with such an effect you shouldn't count on it always being relevant. But the good news is it doesn't force you to bounce things, you can choose not to, and the format also has a ton of upside in blue-green for blinking stuff, because that's the color pair's theme, as is the frog thing. And turning your frogs into mana is nice upside. It means sometimes you'll be able to bounce something and then just cast it using the frogs you have in play, giving this a B. Next up, it's Corpseberry Cultivator, which for one generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana is a 2/3 Squirrel Warlock at common. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may forage, and whenever you forage, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Cultivator. So getting a counter for foraging isn't amazing if that's all that's happening, but in theory, the Cultivator will both trigger your other cards that do stuff when they forage and trigger off of your other cards foraging, and I think all of that makes it a pretty solid card, giving it a C. Next up, it's Dreamdo Entrancer, which for 2 generic, a green and a blue, is a 3/4 frog wizard at rare. It's got reach. When it enters, tap up to one target creature and put 3 stun counters on it. If you control that creature, draw 2 cards. This is a really cool design. I'd like this card a lot if it only ever let you go after your opponent's creatures, since you get a solid body and remove one from the equation for a pretty long time. But then it has this alternate mode where you tap a creature token of your own to draw cards. Basically, if you can immediately leverage an advantage by stunning an opposing creature, you're going to go that route. But if the board is stalled out and stuff like that, you can choose to dig deeper in your deck instead. And if you're in blue-green, you might even be able to blink the stunned creature to get around the downside. I think this is a bomb. It just adds a real body to the board and gets pretty close to removing one at the same time as a baseline. And then it has this additional upside, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Phineas Ace Archer, which for a green and a white is a 2/2 legendary rabbit archer at rare. It's got vigilance and reach, and when it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control that's a token or a rabbit. Then, if creatures you control have total power 10 or greater, draw a card. If you have stuff to buff with this when it attacks, it'll more than make up for the fact that Phineas himself is rather small and likely to die in combat. I wouldn't count on drawing a card with him all the time or anything, but if you get him in like the late game, you can just send him in there to draw a card, and that's pretty nice, giving it a B. Next up, it's Fireglass Mentor, which for a black and a red is a 2/1 Lizard Warlock at uncommon. At the beginning of your second main phase, if an opponent lost life this turn, exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them. Until end of turn, you may play that card. If you can trigger this consistently, it will effectively draw you extra cards, and it'll be the kind of thing that really lets you snowball an advantage. The bad news is it does nothing to help you trigger it on its own, with its subpar body pretty difficult to get the job done with, and if you're behind when you play this, it'll be tough to trigger it. There are ways to do it in the set, of course, but this card has the unfortunate problem of not being that good when you're behind, and even at parity it might not do much. Color pair does have a bunch of random ways to ping the opponent that will make this easier to trigger than it would be in most sets, but I still think it's a C+. Next up, it's Gev Scaled Scorch, which for a black and a red is a 3/2 legendary lizard mercenary at rare. It's got ward, pay 2 life. Other creatures you control enter with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each opponent who lost life this turn. Whenever you cast a lizard spell, Gev Scaled Scorch deals 1 damage to target opponent. A 2-mana 3/2 with ward that makes your opponent pay 2 life is pretty good, as it's an aggressive creature that will always punish the opponent one way or another. So after you throw in all this lizard and life loss upside, you've got a pretty sweet card, and anytime you cast a lizard, it'll do the damage before it enters and then enter with a counter, so Gev pretty much fuels itself when it comes to lizards, and you're going to have a lot of those in black-red. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Glarb Calamities Augur, which for a black, a green, and a blue is a 2/4 legendary frog wizard noble at mythic rare. It's got Death Touch. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may pay lands and cast spells with mana value 4 or greater from the top of your library, and you can tap them to surveil too. So this will let you cast stuff or play lands pretty often thanks to surveil, and being a 2/4 Death Toucher is no small thing either. That can be a tricky body to attack through. If you can just play this in a land from the top of your library on turn 4, you're going to feel great, and that'll be a common outcome. The one downside is being a 3-color card in a set without a ton of support for such a thing, but it still looks pretty good to me, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Head of the Homestead, which for 3 generic and 2 green-white hybrid mana is a 3/2 rabbit citizen at common. When it enters, you create 2 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens. You're never going to feel bad when you cast this. You get 3 bodies after all, and it's pretty hard to lose the game the turn after you cast this, even if you're behind. And if you're at parity, it probably pulls you ahead, and if you're ahead, it probably solidifies your position. It isn't like you're getting a crazy efficient deal or anything. I mean, a 3/2 and 2 1/1s for 5 isn't nuts, but it's pretty good. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Helga, Skittish Sear, which for a green, a white, and a blue is a 1/3 legendary frog druid at Mythic Rare. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4 or greater, you draw a card, gain 1 life, and put a +1/+1 counter on Helga, and you can tap her and add X mana of any one color, where X is her power. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells with mana value 4 or greater, or creature spells with X in their mana costs. Most of her value comes from that 4 mana or greater payoff, as it's huge, netting you not only a card, but a whole bunch of additional value. Her ability to tap for mana can make things snowball too, like if you draw another card that will trigger her, and you can use the mana to cast it. She's 3 colors, has a pretty weak starting point, and you need to build around her a little bit, but I think there's enough upside here for her to be a B+. Next up, it's Hugs Grizzly Guardian, which costs X, 2 red, and 2 green. It's a 5/5 legendary Badger Warrior at Mythic Rare. It's got Trample, and when it enters, you exile the top X cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. He's a little bit challenging to cast as a double red, double green card, but even if you only pay 1 for X, you end up with a 2 for 1 and a very beefy creature, and luckily a 5/5 Trampler is relevant all game long in most cases, so having to wait on it a little while isn't a disaster. Should you ever be able to pump even more mana into X, Hugs is likely to just win you the game. I think it's strong enough to be a bomb, as generating a 2 for 1 with him is very doable, and the ceiling is even higher, giving him an A-. Next up, it's the infamous Cruel Claw, which for 1 generic, a black, and a red, is a 3/3 legendary Weasel Mercenary at Mythic Rare. It's got Menace, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land. You may cast that card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. If you can get in with this, casting a spell for free is nuts. You'd have to wait a turn, and even with Menace, there are many board states where it can't do its thing, and discarding a card does mean you're not actually netting a card, you're usually just gaining a mana advantage, but there are going to be times where you play this on turn 3, you're able to kill something so your opponent can't block Cruel Claw, it gets in, and then you cast something that costs 5 or 6 for no mana at all. There's a good chance you just pull ahead and stay ahead when that happens. The problem is it gets worse the later in the game, since a 3/3 isn't exactly insane or anything. It's still a really good card, but I don't think a bomb. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Junk Blade Bruiser, which for 3 generic and 2 red-green hybrid mana is a 4/5 Raccoon Berserker at common. It's got Trample. Whenever you expend 4, it gets +2/+1 until end of turn, and you expend 4 as you spend your 4th total mana to cast spells during a turn. So a 5 mana 4/5 Trampler is a D+ or C- these days, but this will sometimes be 6/6, and you can even do it at instant speed if you have an expensive enough instant. I think this looks pretty solid as support for the red-green deck, giving it a C. Next up, it's Castol, the Wind Crested, which for 3 generic, a white, and a blue is a 4/5 legendary Bird Scout at Rare. It's got flying, and whenever 1 or more birds you control deals combat damage to a player, you choose one. You can put a bird creature card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield with a finality counter on it. You can put a +1/+1 counter on each bird you control, or you can draw a card. Castol does count itself, so triggering this is pretty easy, since it gives you a nice efficient creature too. Obviously, it gets better the more birds you have, but drawing a card is always good, so even if you don't have birds to really generate more value here, Castol is going to do some serious work, and I think you'll get value out of this the turn you play it often enough for it to be a bomb, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Lily Splash Mentor, which for 2 generic, a green, and a blue, is a 4/4 Frog Druid at uncommon. It's got Reach, and you can pay 1 generic, a green, and a blue, and exile another target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it, activate only as a sorcery. This activated ability can be nice, especially in blue-green, which has incentives for blinking things, but there is kind of a problem with it. Namely, if your opponent has mana up, it's really dangerous to use. Since it's only sorcery speed, your opponent can wait to interact with it until you use the ability, and the tempo hit when that goes down is huge, and the payoff for the ability usually isn't completely insane anyway. So I think a lot of the time the risk outweighs the upside, and that's kind of a problem. It does have solid stats, and that ability is some nice value in the right situation, but I think it's a C+ signpost uncommon. Next up, it's Lunar Convocation, which for a white and a black is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, each opponent loses 1 life. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained and lost life this turn, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. You can pay 1 generic and a black and 2 life and draw a card. So as long as you have a way to gain life in your turn, this can do the life loss part for you, and the activated ability will effectively draw you a card and make a bat at that point. And black-white in this format has plenty of ways to gain life. The theme of the color pair is about gaining and losing life, although most of the cards that pay you off for it don't care which you do, whereas this one wants you to do both in a single turn, which is certainly more challenging. But I think you're going to end up in a black-white deck that can gain and lose life enough for this to be a pretty nice build-around. I think if you're in a really synergistic black-white deck, it's probably one of the better cards in your deck, like a B, but in a lot of the decks in the format, it's probably just a D. Next up, it's Mabel, Heir to Cragflame, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 3/3 legendary mouse soldier at rare. Other mice you control get +1/+1, and when she enters, you create Cragflame, a legendary colorless equipment artifact token with equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has vigilance, trample, and haste, and equipped for 2 generic. So if you take the mouse part out of the equation, this would probably be a very, very good card. The equipment it gives you is legit enough to be close to being worth the whole card, so it's going to feel like a 2-for-1. Throw in the fact that she buffs one of the more common creature types in the set, especially in red-white, and she's firmly in the bomb range. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Minddrill Assailant, which for 2 generic and 2 blue-black hybrid mana is a 2/5 rat warlock at common. It's got Threshold, and that means as long as there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, something good happens. In this case, it gets +3/+0, and you can also pay 2 generic and a blue-black hybrid mana to surveil 1. So the blue-black deck in this format is a Threshold deck, and so this is a conditional 4 mana 5/5. I don't love that. It can surveil and help set up Threshold for itself and other stuff, but it does so kind of inefficiently. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Moonrise Cleric, which for 1 generic and 2 black-white hybrid mana is a 2/3 bat cleric at common. It's got flying. Whenever it attacks, you gain 1 life. This is one of the better creatures in this cycle of hybrid-costed things. A 3 mana 2/3 flyer is passable, and this is a good enabler for all the life gain payoffs in the set, in addition to having a good creature type, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Moira, Trash Tactician, which for 1 generic, a red, and a green, is a 2/4 legendary creature raccoon warrior at rare. At the beginning of your main phase, you add red or green for each raccoon you control. Whenever you expend 4, you gain 3 life, and whenever you expend 8, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. Moira counts itself, so you're going to get at least 1 mana during each of your main phases, and that's good because you want to be spending as much mana as possible in order to trigger the expend things here. Gaining 3 life when you cast a big spell is a pretty nice payoff in Limited that can help you stabilize when you couldn't before. Expending 8 is a little tricky, but if you can do it, you're going to get a whole card worth of value, which is pretty great. You won't usually be able to play that card until your next turn, but Moira gives you that long to use it, so that's okay. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Plume Creed Mentor, which for 1 generic, a white and a blue, is a 2/3 bird scout at uncommon. It's got flying. Whenever it or another creature you control with flying enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control without flying. This is a little awkward. If you're blue-white, you just want to jam your deck full of flyers, but the Mentor doesn't do anything unless you have both a flyer and a non-flyer in play. It's not a massive ask, but it does restrict how often you're going to be able to get a counter out of this. The good news is that a 3 mana 2/3 flyer is okay, and even if you only ever get like 1 counter out of it, the investment is pretty good, and sometimes you can probably go off, but still, I don't like that these cards in this set for the blue-white archetype make you have a mix of flyers and non-flyers. It would be better if it was just one way or the other. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Pond Prophet, which for 2 blue-green hybrid mana is a 1/1 Frog Advisor at common. When it enters, you draw a card. I always like Elvish Visionary, and that's kind of what this is. It's harder to cast in anything but blue-green, but super easy to cast there. It's got a useful creature type, and it's one of the better things you can start blinking in the early game if you're in the blue-green deck. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Rawl Crackling Wit, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker Rawl at Mythic Rare. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a loyalty counter on Rawl. He's got a +1 that makes a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess, a -3 that draws 3 and then you discard 2, and a -10 that says draw 3 cards. You get an emblem with instant and sorcery spells you cast have Storm. His +1 is where the most value is in Limited. Planeswalkers that make tokens by ticking up their loyalty are always great in Limited, and that's what we have here. If you're super far behind for some reason, you can use his -3 up front and hopefully find a way out of your situation, and obviously his ultimate has the potential to be insane, although it's actually kind of hard to go off with Storm and Limited. But to add to all that is the ability to gain loyalty counters when you do the thing that blue-red is all about in this set, casting non-creature spells, and I think we've got a bomb Planeswalker. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Seedglaive Mentor, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 3/2 Mouse Soldier at uncommon. It's got Vigilance and Haste, and it has Valiant, which means when it becomes a target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, something happens. In this case, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is what the red-white deck is about, targeting your stuff. A 3-mana 3/2 with Vigilance and Haste is a solid card, and the Mentor can grow pretty easily in a set filled with ways to trigger Valiant. I think this is a pretty nice signpost. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Seed Pod Squire, which for 3 generic and a white-blue hybrid mana is a 3/3 Bird Scout at common. It's got flying, and when it attacks, target creature you control without flying gets +1/+1 until end of turn. A 4-mana 3/3 flyer isn't what it once was, but when it's a card's baseline, that's not too shabby. This will help one of your other creatures attack a decent chunk of the time, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Sear Mentor, which for 3 generic, a white and a black, is a 3/5 Bat Warlock at uncommon. It's got flying and vigilance, and at the beginning of your instep, if you gained or lost life this turn, target opponent loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. The payoff here is really strong. Your opponent has to give up something legit anytime you lose or gain life during your turn, and you have a pretty solid body to go with it. Black-white is very capable of gaining and paying life. Just one trigger of this will feel fine, and sometimes you'll be able to take over a game. Your opponent can make a choice that affects them the least, and usually that means the first trigger of this doesn't feel great, but usually by the second time you get one of these triggers going, your opponent has to make a much harder decision, and the more you can keep it going, the bigger problem it is. So overall, I think this looks pretty good. As a signpost uncommon, I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Stormcatch Mentor, which for a blue and a red is a 1/1 Otter Wizard at uncommon. It's got haste and prowess, and instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. Being a 1/1 with prowess and haste isn't that great in Limited. This is because just to be able to survive combat against other 2-drops, you'll often need to trigger prowess twice, early, and that's easier said than done, even with your spells being cheaper. The cost reduction effect is nice, but 1/1s are just so fragile, and paying 2 for one of them, even one with upside, gives me some serious pause. I think this might just be a C. Next up, it's Tempest Angler, which for 1 generic and 2 blue-red hybrid mana is a 2/2 Otter Wizard at common. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. A 3-mana 2/2 is a rough starting point too. We've seen that time and time again on creatures that can grow. It means that this is usually going to be very easy to attack through or kill, even with 1 or 2 mana spells, and having to jump through hoops just to grow this to the point where it isn't a liability isn't that appealing. You'll probably play this in your blue-red decks in the format, but I don't even think it'll always make the cut, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Tidecaller Mentor, which for 1 generic, a blue and a black, is a 3/3 Rat Wizard at uncommon. It's got Menace and Threshold. When it enters the battlefield, you return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. A 3-mana 3/3 Menace that always bounces something would be an amazing card, like B+ level. Adding such a real body to the board while taking something away from your opponent is great. Obviously, that's not what we have here, as Threshold is a pretty big ask, at least in the early game. Like, casting this on 3 and getting the bounce won't be that common of an occurrence. Still, if you're just curving out with a 3/3 Menace, it feels good, and by the later game, it's pretty likely to be powerful. I think it's a B- overall. Next up, it's Veteran Guard Mouse, which for 3 generic and a red-white hybrid mana is a 3/4 Mouse Soldier at common. It's got Valiant, and it gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn, scry 1. That's a very real buff, the kind that your opponent has to respect anytime it attacks them. A 4/4 first strike can just annihilate a huge swath of creatures without dying itself, and I think that means that this mouse will get in for 3 a lot when you have mana up and you attack. And even if you don't have the mana up and have to do something at sorcery speed, the thing is still hard to block. The baseline isn't awesome, but triggering this regularly seems fairly realistic, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Vine Reap Mentor, which for a black and a green is a 3/2 Squirrel Druid at uncommon. When it enters or dies, you create a food token. A 3/2 body and 2 food for only 2 mana is pretty awesome. You're not going to get them all at the same time, of course, but that is ultimately what you get here. Black-green is very interested in having food around for all its cards with forage. This just looks like a really strong card just in terms of the amount of value it gives you for the cost, giving it a B. Next up, it's Vren the Relentless, which for 2 generic, a blue and a black, is a 3/4 legendary rat rogue at rare. It's got Ward 2. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. At the beginning of each end step, create X 1/1 black rat creature tokens with. This creature gets +1/+1 for each other rat you control, where X is the number of creatures your opponents controlled that were exiled this turn. If you can get Vren going, he's pretty insane, as he's going to spit out ever-growing rat tokens, and it's nice he triggers during each end step, making your opponent wary about attacking or blocking, whether it's your turn or theirs. What's not nice is that actually getting those tokens takes some work. It's great that he turns virtually any trade into something profitable for you, but there are going to be times where you can't set up trades and your opponent doesn't have to offer them. Obviously, tacking a rat token onto all of your removal is pretty sweet, and the ward does mean you're more likely to get at least 1 token out of this before your opponent can take it down, and sometimes you'll get insane value. But I think it's hard enough to get going that it's not quite a bomb. I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it's Wandertail Mentor, which for a red and a green is a 2/2 Raccoon Bard at uncommon. Whenever you expend 4, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it can tap for red or green mana. I'm already signing up for a 2-mana 2/2 that taps for red or green, and this will get a few counters in most games too. I mean, you could play this on turn 2, and then on turn 3 drop a 4-drop that will turn this into a 3/3, in addition to the fact that you played your 4-drop ahead of schedule. That's going to start a lot of games off. Really good position for red-green decks. I'm giving this a B. Next, it's Egra Eater of All, which for 3 generic, a black and a green, is a 6/6 legendary elemental cat at mythic rare. It has Ward, Sacrifice of Food. Other creatures are food artifacts in addition to their other types and have 2 generic tap, sack this permanent, you gain 3 life. Whenever a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Egra Eater of All. So because he makes all creatures food, including your opponents, his ward isn't that hard for them to activate. That said, if they have to sacrifice a creature just to target Egra, you're going to come out ahead, and in the meantime, all those food creatures dying makes Egra absolutely massive. There are going to be turns where you play this and you just attack with your board and your opponent can't do anything worthwhile, because if they trade, Egra gets huge. If they don't trade, they take a bunch of damage. It's just going to put your opponent in really bad spots, because he counts every single food that dies. It's not whenever 1 or more foods is put into a graveyard, it's each food. So Egra gets to be pretty big. I think all of that makes it a bomb, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Zoraline Cosmos Caller, which for 1 generic, a white and a black, is a 3/3 legendary bat cleric at rare. It's got flying and vigilance. Whenever a bat you control attacks, you gain 1 life. And when Zoraline enters or attacks, you can pay black, white, and 2 life. When you do, return target non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. This is a very efficient creature that will gain you 1 life when it attacks. It also counts each bat individually, so you can gain a bunch of life. Sometimes the turn Zoraline comes down. Zoraline also has an amazing into the battlefield / attack trigger. Running this out on 5 is going to be the more preferable option most of the time, since you'll end up with this nice 3/3 flying vigilance body and some other creature from your graveyard, at which point we're already talking about a 2-for-1. And after that, Zoraline can reanimate other stuff too, which is just crazy. This is a bomb, giving it an A. Now we're moving to artifacts. We've got Bark Form Harvester, which costs 3 generic for a 2/3 artifact creature shapeshifter at common. It's got Changeling, which means it has every creature type. It's got Reach, and you can pay 2 generic to put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Having all creature types is useful in this format, and sometimes the activated ability will come up, like if you're a deck that's milling yourself a bunch and you need to put cards back in your library. But it's pretty narrow, and overall this card's not very good at any of the stuff it does. It does a bunch of stuff mediocrely. You'd rather just have better creatures with the types you're looking for, which doesn't look very hard in this set. This probably only makes the cut when you're desperate, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Bumbleflower's Sharepot, which for 2 generic is a common artifact. When it enters, you make a food token, and you can pay 5 and tap it and sacrifice the Sharepot to destroy target non-land permanent, activate only as a sorcery. This isn't very good, even in a food set. You get 2 permanents, but the pot isn't a food itself, so it doesn't really matter, and the late game activated ability is unlikely to be impactful often enough. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Fountainport Bell, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. When it enters, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, then shuffle and put that card on top, and you can pay 1 generic and sack the bell to draw a card. 1 mana artifacts that you can pay 1 for to sacrifice and search for a land tend to be solid and limited. They provide pretty nice fixing, and that's basically what this is, except it's a little more flexible, since you can decide not to put a land on top and just draw the top card of your library if you want to, which is what you're going to do in the later game when you've got more than enough mana. This kind of card can even let you play fewer lands, which is always nice. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Heirloom Epic, which for 1 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 4 generic and tap it to draw a card, and for each mana in this ability's activation cost, you may tap an untapped creature you control rather than pay that mana. Activate only as a sorcery. This design's really cool. So you can pay for this with some mix of pseudo convoke by tapping your creatures and by also tapping lands for mana as usual. When you've got the bodies and the time to just tap 4 creatures and have all your mana available, that'll feel especially good. Paying 4 for this straight up isn't the worst late game mana sink either. I think the flexibility with which you can pay for this and the fact that it can be a legit source of card advantage, especially in the late game, makes it pretty good. You do need to have lots of creatures, but that doesn't look that crazy in this set. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Patchwork Banner, which for 3 generic is an uncommon artifact. As it enters, you choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. In most formats, this would just be a D. Manalith isn't that great, and most of the time, there's just not enough of a typal theme to make a tribe-specific anthem worth it. But this set isn't most sets. Every single color pair is a creature type it's interested in, and having 7 or more cards with the same creature type is going to be pretty automatic. And that might be a low estimate. This still isn't insane as it doesn't do much on its own, but it's definitely playable, and the fixing it gives you is nice to have on top of the anthem, giving it a C. Next up, it's Starforged Sword, which for 4 generic is an uncommon artifact equipment. It comes with Gift a Tapped Fish. That means you can promise an opponent a gift as you cast it. If you do, when it enters, they create a tapped 1/1 blue fish creature token. When this enters, if the gift was promised, you attach it to target creature you control. The equipped creature gets +3/+3 and loses flying, and it has equipped for 3 generic. A 4-mana equipment that gives +3/+3 takes away flying and costs 3 to equip isn't great. It is a buff that can make most anything into a formidable creature, although taking away flying does come up and is a real downside. I guess it does give you a way to get payouts for controlling non-flyers in that blue-white deck, but I don't think that's the main use here. Giving your opponent the fish with this makes things more interesting since you get that first equip for free. But that fish gives them 1 free chump blocker too, so I'm not sold on that being that great. The boost is legit enough that I can see this making the cut sometimes, but I think it's probably just a C-. Next, there's Tangle Tumbler, which for 3 generic is a 6/6 artifact vehicle at uncommon. It's got Vigilance, and you can pay 3 generic and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. You can also tap 2 untapped tokens you control, and Tangle Tumbler becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. This is pretty interesting. It doesn't have a crew cost as a backup plan, which kind of stinks. I would have liked if this had like crew 5 or something so that you could turn it into a creature even when you don't have tokens, because that is a pretty big downside. But the good news is it doesn't say what kind of token. So food works, for example, and if you can crew this thing consistently, a 6/6 vigilance for 3 is a pretty good deal. The ability is definitely expensive and really only the kind of thing you're going to use in the late game when you have nothing else to do with your mana, but it does trigger Valiant. This probably needs a build around grade because you just can't be playing it in a deck that doesn't have like 8 ways to make tokens. You're likely to have those in both black-green and green-white, I think. So this is probably a D in your typical deck in the format, but I could see it being a C+ in token decks. Next up, it's 3 Tree Mascot, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature shapeshifter at common. It's got Changeling, and you can pay 1 generic and add 1 mana of any color. Activate only once each turn. We've basically seen this card before in Zendikar Rising, another set that cared about creature types, and it performed pretty well. I think this will too. It fixes your mana well and will be able to take advantage of typal payoffs, both of which are, of course, useful. Giving this a C. Let's move to lands now. Our first one is Fabled Passage, which is a rare land. You can tap it and sacrifice it. Search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Then if you control 4 or more lands, you untap that land. This is a reprint, and it's always a nice land. It's like Evolving Wilds, but you get the land untapped from the mid-game on, and that's not a small thing. We've all been relying on fetches that grab lands and put them into play tapped before, and having to wait a full turn before playing your splashed bomb in the mid to late game can be a serious problem. So this is really good fixing. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Fountain Port, which is a rare land. It can tap for colorless. You can also pay 2 and tap it to sack a token and draw a card. You can pay 3 and tap it and pay a life to make a 1/1 blue fish creature token. And you can pay 4 generic and tap it to create a treasure token. Lands that don't produce colored mana often aren't worth the hit to your mana base, but that's not true here. This just does a whole bunch of good stuff. Cashing in tokens for cards is a big deal in the format, and obviously enough, it can make the very same tokens you sacrifice with its other 2 activated abilities. The best of all these abilities is making the 1/1, as that actually adds to the board, and it's a nice way to spend your mana in the late game. And it even gives you a way to pay life if you're interested in getting some bonuses out of that. I think this is a B-, because it's a land that turns into a value engine in the late game, and that's pretty valuable. Next up, it's Hidden Grotto, a common land that surveils 1 when it enters. You can tap it for colorless, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it for 1 mana of any color. This was a nice little land when we last saw it. It isn't insane, it's not the best fixing, and the format doesn't have a huge multicolor theme to begin with, but it isn't the worst way to fix your mana, and the extra graveyard value does matter for some black decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Lilypad Village, an uncommon land that can tap for colorless. It can also tap for blue, spend this mana only to cast a creature spell, and you can pay 1 blue and tap it to surveil 2, but you can only activate it if a bird, frog, otter, or a rat entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So a land that can always surveil for 2 for 1 mana would be great, but this is pretty far from that. Sure, in blue you're likely to have creatures with these types in this format, but you need to have them enter on that turn to activate it, and you need the mana available. That seems pretty far from a guarantee to me. It's a nice utility land, but it does hurt your mana a bit for an effect that's pretty finicky. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Lupin Flower Village, which is an uncommon land. It can tap for colorless. It can also tap for white, but you can spend that mana only on creature spells. You can pay 1 generic and a white and tap it and sacrifice it to look at the top 6 cards of your library, and you can reveal a bat, bird, mouse, or rabbit card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this one turns into a nice card selection spell in the late game, and if you're digging 6 deep in white, it'll be pretty hard to whiff with this. Although obviously, if you're somehow very low on these creature types, you just can't play this. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mudflat Village, which is an uncommon land. It can tap for colorless. You can tap it for black, but you can spend that mana only to cast a creature spell. And you can pay 1 generic and a black and tap it and sacrifice it to return a bat, lizard, rat, or squirrel card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a nice effect in the late game, turning one of your lands in play into the best bat, lizard, rat, or squirrel in your graveyard is pretty sweet. So I like this utility land a little more than the other ones we've seen so far. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Oak Hollow Village, which is an uncommon land. You can tap it for colorless. You can also tap it for green, but only for creature spells. And you can pay 1 green to put a +1/+1 counter on each frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control that entered the battlefield this turn. If you're in green, you're going to have cards with these types, even without trying, and this is a nice effect. You'll have the spare mana lying around by the mid to late game, and an extra counter here or there is a big deal. It's also nice that if you put multiple creatures with these types into play in a turn, you get multiple counters, and doing so isn't crazy. There are a bunch of cards that make multiple rabbits, for example, so this looks pretty good to me, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Rockface Village, which is an uncommon land that can tap for colorless. It can add a red, and you can spend that mana only to cast creature spells, and you can pay 1 red and tap it, and target lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon you control gets +1/+0 and gains haste until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. This is another pretty nice buff that kind of adds a kicker of 1 red mana to all your creatures with these types. That'll let them have haste and get +1/+0 until end of turn. It's also nice you can use this buff on something even if it's already in play, which obviously isn't as good, but the rest of these care about when the creature entered and this doesn't, so keep that in mind. I think this one's a C+. Next up, it's Three Tree City, a rare legendary land. When it enters, you choose a creature type. It can tap for colorless, and you pay 2 generic and tap it and choose a color at an amount of mana of that color equal to the number of creatures you control of the chosen type. This one's not good. Even in a typal set like this one, making this worthwhile is rough. This is because you need more than 3 creatures in play with that type before you actually net mana with it. Furthermore, you need to have something to spend that mana on, which is also far from guaranteed and limited. Having both of those things line up where you're producing tons of mana and can actually sink it into something just isn't that likely. I'm giving this a D. And our last card is Uncharted Haven, a common land. It enters tapped, and as it enters, you choose a color, and you add 1 mana of the chosen color when it taps. This is quality fixing for pretty much any deck, even 2-color ones, though it does get a little bit worse if you're in a deck that has several 1-drops. So if you're really aggressive, you probably shouldn't bother, but it's fine, giving it a C. So those are all the multicolored and colorless cards in Bloomburrow. Tomorrow I'll be back to take a look at all the white ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the set review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to gain access to a spreadsheet with all of my grades on it when the set review is over, you can do so by becoming a channel member or a patron. Thanks for watching.